Hi everyone, and welcome to this video where we are going to discuss a few backgrounds on lecture design, communication, and we will use this as basis to derive the approach for this particular training. So in this video, we are not going to touch the technical aspects, rather we want to work on a few theoretical aspects to better understand what is relevant for remote trainings and teaching scenarios. So first of all, let's start with the basic concepts on how to design an individual lecture or a training. So sometimes people just start with, well, we have this PowerPoint, we have this Zoom calls, and we have this fantastic MS Teams or whatever. So we are approaching it from the bottom, from which technology we have and what can we do with it. So the better approach, in my opinion, is to start with considering first, what is my audience? What is their background? What are their expectations? And what is the learning goal? So what shall change for the audience after attending my training or my lecture? And depending on the audience and their particular goal, then we can start asking the question, what is the appropriate format for this training? Should it be a lecture? Should it be a training, a workshop, a consulting session, or whatever comes to your mind? So choosing the appropriate format is basically the fundament for everything else that we are doing. After we have clarified on which format we are going to choose and to prepare, then we can start considering which practices and methods do we want to utilize. Like, do we want to use concepts like storytelling? Is it just a front perspective teaching? Or do you want to utilize some aspects like storytelling or drawing? Whatever comes to your mind. And then after clarification of the didactics approach, of the practices and the methods, then in the final step, we can talk about which infrastructure and tools are we using. And this is basically nothing specifically for remote scenarios. The same thing is what you would do in an on-site training as well. You would consider, do we make group works? How do I transport my message? Do I want to make a drawing, storytelling, exercises, videos, or whatever? So we are considering infrastructure and tools just to enable the above identified practices and methods. Okay, so it's more a bottom-up than a top-down approach. The common aspect here, however, the crucial part is that through all these layers, we have the communication aspect. So everything we do is communication in two directions and with different methods and means. So it really pays to first reflect on the basics of communication before we derive specific aspects for remote settings. So I guess most of you already are doing trainings and teaching, so you are pretty well aware of the 5 axioms of communication as proposed by Václavic, an Austrian guy, just to mention. And I think the first one is pretty well known. It says one cannot not communicate. And now you can say, well, but in a remote teaching, if I forget to mute my microphone, I do not communicate. But that's only half the truth. Because in fact you do communicate, but you're communicating that you cannot master your equipment and your infrastructure. So this is also a kind of message, probably not the message you want to send, but it is a message. More important for our goal of considering remote scenarios, however, is the second axiom, which says that every communication has a content and a relationship. So there are two aspects. Such that the latter classifies the former and is therefore a meta-communication. So we can conclude that communication takes place on two layers. And maybe a few of you already learned about the iceberg model, which is a synonym for this. So something we have above the surface is the content, which is basically the content that we transport. And I also like to add here the second aspect, how the content is transported, how communication takes place. So the key aspect here is that this is the visible part. We have a content that is communicated, and we have a way of communicating how is communicated. And like in every good iceberg model, we also have something below the surface. So when the content that is communicated takes place above the surface, then below the surface we have a hidden layer, which is the relationship layer. And the important thing now is that the relationship that is established between the sender, like the trainer or the teacher, and the audience frames the content. So depending on your relation, the communication of the content will differ. It's interpreted differently. You're giving it a different setting. So these relations need to be mentioned anyways. So the key message here is that you actively have to shape the relationship layer before you can consider the content layer. And this is one of the aspects for remote teaching that we need to consider in detail. So typically in a training scenario, we start in the morning with having a coffee break. So we establish a relation with each other. Then also during the communication, the way that we interact, the way how we present ourselves, this also contributes to the relation. It can be a relation on the same level, like we would see it in a coaching session, but it also can be a relation with a hierarchy, for example, between a teacher and a student. So the thing is, when we talk about teaching and training in remote settings, it's not enough to only consider the content, what's above the surface, the visible part, but we also need to consider the relationship layer, the hidden layer. Okay? So with this understanding, let's dig a little bit deeper into communication. What is communication? So a common concept for understanding how communication takes place is the so-called Shannon-Weaver model of communication, which already has been established in 1984. So it's not the newest thing, but it's still valid. What is interesting to understand is that this model has been established for a technical communication, so on a telecommunication networks, but it really is applicable to communication in general as well. So let's take a little bit closer look. So the easy thing is that every communication, everything that is communicated, of course, covers three different aspects. We have the sender on the one hand, we have the message that shall be transported, and we have a receiver. And very often we tend to only concentrate on the message, and we try to integrate it in fancy PowerPoints, and we say, yeah, that's the message. But we don't pay attention to ourselves, the sender, and the receiver. So at this point, it's necessary to always consider all these three aspects when it comes to communication. So also in a remote setting, which makes it sometimes a little bit difficult, and we work on that in a few videos. So, but this fundamental concept is not yet enough, because we have some different other aspects as well. So every message that we are going to send to the receiver needs to be encoded and decoded. So this can happen in different ways. For example, probably you know it from on-site trainings. If you want to transport a message to a receiver, you probably choose out of your toolbox of different didactics approach. So you can use just presentations with PowerPoint for sure. You can use the development of drawings on a flip chart, which is a creative aspect that triggers different regions in the brain. You can use elements such as storytelling, but you also can encode the message inside a learning effect. So we try to, for example, we try to create an exercise which reveals a certain learning effect to the participants, to the receivers. So in on-site trainings, we already have a pretty nice toolbox of didactic concepts and methods that enable us to encode the message. The important aspect here is when you encode your message, that of course you should be well aware about the receiver, that she or he is able to decode the message as well. So if you, for example, use terminology or taxonomies, then that the people really can relate to the topics that you're using. Yeah, that's an important question. Another point is the background. Are the people capable of dealing with the way how you integrate or how you encode your message? So different aspects to be considered. In on-site trainings and teaching, we all have our toolbox and we are fine. And the question for remote trainings is, which methods do we know or can we master to encode our message and present it to the receivers? So we need a variance or a variety of different concepts. Unfortunately, the transport of the message is also confronted with some noise. Yeah. So in physical environments, for sure, we know that people become tired, they are distracted, whatever. Yeah. And the same thing is valid for remote settings. So we always have some noise that covers our message. And we try to increase the signal noise ratio, so the distance between the message that we want to transport and the noise that participants are confronted with. In a remote scenario, for example, this could be that people are confused with the infrastructure, that their settings are not working, and so they they have to concentrate on getting their infrastructure running, and all the complicated tools and all these distractions that happen, and all this can be interpreted as a noise. So when you design your lecture or your training and you decide on the infrastructure, always consider what could be the noise that distracts receivers from my message. Yeah, another aspect to be mentioned. Yeah, and finally, communication is not a one-way direction. Communication relies on a two-way direction. So we also want to get some feedback from the receiver to learn about, did she or he understand what I was trying to communicate? So here we come back again to the concept of remote training. So how do you establish a feedback channel, which makes the participants to a sender and which turns you into a receiver? And here are various aspects to be mentioned. This can be a technical infrastructure, like, do I see my participants? Do I see a picture to read their body language? Or this also can be something like, are they willing, do they dare to use the microphone and to make a statement in a web call? Yeah? So the key message of this topic is that for communication, we have to consider and actively manage all of these aspects and not only the message and the content that we want to present. Okay? To ensure that our message is transported just in the way that we want to transport it. The message itself, however, is not only the factual message. So we have another model, which is pretty interesting. It's the so-called Foresights model, which has been proposed by Friedemann Schulz von Thun. I think the number is wrong, don't blame me on that. So maybe you also know it as 4 ears model. And we can interpret this concept as a detailing of Watzlawicks axiom number 2, which again says there is a content layer, content aspect, and a relationship layer and relation aspect. So in fact, this model further refines this axiom and it says, besides the factual information here, we have 3 different relationship aspects that come to surface. I make it a little bit bigger for you. So on the one hand, we have a self-revelation, so we reveal something about us whenever we communicate. Then we have an appeal aspect, which means I want the participants to know something, to do something. That's my appeal that I want to transport. And everything is resting on the relationship layer. So what is the relation between you and I? The we relation between sender and receiver, teacher or trainer, and audience. So the interesting thing here now is that all of these layers are a subject of interpretation. So whenever we communicate a message, we really should try to be clear about the communication on all these 4 aspects. Yeah? to prevent misinterpretation and stuff like that. So the message here is, when you plan what to communicate, actively shape all sides of the message, not only the factual information, but be clear about the remaining three aspects of the relation layer as well. And in the remote training, this brings us back to the challenge: how do we shape these things? How do we actively communicate the content, how to present it, which didactics approach, and how do we integrate and shape the remaining three aspects? That's a question that we need to answer in the following videos, which give us a few ideas on how we can proceed with these aspects. So all these basics, I think most of you are well aware of the fundamentals of didactics and communication. So all these basics need to be reflected now in reference to remote settings. So what does this mean for remote teaching or remote trainings? So first of all, we need to be aware of the relationship aspect. So all these on-site concepts that we know for establishing a relationship, like eye contact, like having a coffee together, having a brief chat, making some jokes, all these things don't work. So we need to deal with it in a more realistic way, in a more holistic way. So how do we do it? First of all, we need to consider the factual relationship that we have anyways. As I mentioned before, is it a eye-level relation that we would like to have in a coaching session? Like, coaching happens on an eye level, yeah? Or is it, for example, a complementary relation, like something we have between a teacher and a student, where the teacher is expected to be the professional guy who really knows, and the students are those that want to learn from the professional one. Yeah? So we need to understand the existing relation and try to actively anticipate it. And this already brings us to the topic of shaping the relationship. Yeah, so for every session that we do, for every training, every lecture, we need to consider how to shape the relationship. And there are two different aspects. The first thing is you have an implicit shaping. So the relation is already determined and shaped, for example, by the way that you act. Let's say, for example, in a positive way, if you really appear in a professional setting, yeah, then you send a message, you establish a relation, and the relation says, I put effort into this, I'm a professional, you can trust me. Or I put effort in preparation, I really take care to to give you the best possible training, I care about your time. So this already helps establishing trust. But this also goes into some negative sense. Like if you're not familiar with your equipment, you have troubles with getting your settings running, you act like to some level unprofessional, then people are like, whoa, does he know what he's doing? Did I ask the right guy for this training? Yeah, am I in a good place right here? Yeah? So these elements already contribute to the trainer and audience relation, and you really should make something like a customer journey, or if you want to, just to understand how is the relation between me and my audience established, and what does it look like. Yeah, that's the implicit part that happens anyway. The second part is the explicit shaping of relation. So as we know, for example, we do not have coffee breaks. We don't have the welcome coffee in a training. So in remote sessions, so how can we compensate for that? And here I will show you some concepts later, how to establish such a explicit shaping of the relationship right in advance of the training, how to get familiar with the participants, so that in the ideal scenario, when the training starts, you already meet friends. So you have a solid basis, which is the profound ground to transfer all the things that you want to communicate. That's the relationship aspect, shaping it in an active way. The second thing is the communication aspect. So as we have seen before, communication covers many different aspects, not only the PowerPoints that I present. It covers the noise that could take place, it covers the encoding and decoding of the message, and of course, it covers the audience. Yeah? So what we really need to do is, when we set up a remote scenario, we need to consider all these aspects of the communication process, and these aspects we will discuss later in the training. And the other part of this aspect is how to transport your message. So again, we need some competence and some skills to transport our message in different possible ways. So having someone who is presenting voice over PowerPoint is one way to transport a message, but maybe it's not the best possible way. So we need to establish, or we need to create a toolbox for remote teaching, which enables us to transport our message on basis of different concepts, like all the concepts that we know from on-site training. Yeah, and the last aspect is the message itself. So how do you create your message? How do you encode your message? And for that reason, it's important to shape all sides of the message. You remember the 4 ears model, which says that every message is interpreted in reference to 4 different aspects. So we should really try to shape all sides of the message to be well aware of what exactly will be received by the audience. So to ensure that really that message is transported or is received that I wanted to send. So these are basically the main things that we can draw from basic communication theory, and these things that we need to consider individually when it comes to remote setting. And this brings us to the question how to approach this topic. So let's take a look what the training approach for this training is like. So I decided to make a bottom-up approach, which means first we are going to learn the basics, the basic competences like the craft, and we will learn about different elements for remote settings like presentations, drawings, doing exercises and stuff like that. And we will also use the time to not only learn the technical competences, but to reflect on their utilization in context of a didactic approach. So like we have learned this tool or this method, how can we embed it or how can we utilize it in context of our particular didactics approach? And for all these things, we will learn about the technology and the particular usage. So step by step, no worry, you will go through it in a detailed level. So you're able to reproduce everything. And I'm also trying to complement it with some tips and tricks that I learned during my last year where I did plenty of such remote trainings. And maybe some of these things are helpful for you, then I'm happy. And maybe you know some things that I don't know, then I'm really happy to learn about these things. So you can leave it in the comments, and I think all the other students of this course will appreciate it as well. So this is basically the first part. Learn the craft, the basics, the technology. And then in the second part, we are going to consider how to combine these things, how to integrate it in a remote training. And so we start with a more holistic perspective, and we start considering how to structure such a remote element, which doesn't start right in the moment when the call opens, but it already starts in advance when it comes to establishing the relationship with your audience, when it comes to participants onboarding and all that stuff. And then we will further discuss about different formats for remote settings, possible didactics approach for remote scenarios, and everything that comes to our mind. And of course, also here, I'm happy to share some best practices with you to give you an overall concept which really should enable you to quickly start with remote settings and to really deliver an experience which makes all of your audience happy. No matter if it's a lecture at university, if it's a workshop with customers or a training with customers as well. So I hope you like this one and see you in the next video where we start with the fundamentals like how to make good presentations in a remote setting.